The struggle at the engine house. The car bounced wildly along the track, despite its travelling at little more than walking pace. The moon was rising low, visible through the ragged clouds. Only the last remnants of daylight glowed over the wide horizon of sea and sky. Inside, the occupants jolted from side to side chaotically, the motion doing little to soothe their taut nerves. Amber sat behind the wheel, her knuckles white as she gripped it tightly, her face grave and set firm. Beside her, Jack stared at the silhouette of Wheel Owls, the engine house in the distance ahead, framed evocatively against the deep purple. In the back sat Jacob, crammed into the limited space, with his head awkwardly crooked against the roof. As ever, he had not uttered a word during the journey from the professor's house, for golems cannot speak. Jack looked round at him for a moment, but likewise said nothing. There had been little conversation in the car. He and Amber both knew what they had to do, and as for Jacob, well, he had nodded obediently as he received his instructions. Professor Silverman's parting words echoed in Jack's mind, doing little to improve his spirits. "You have to remember," he said, as he stood at the door to see them off, "that these people are not as they seem. They are no longer the Conservation Society acting in a rational way. Their minds are now taken over by whatever it was that escaped from the mine. They are dangerous, and we don't know how much they know or are expecting. You must be extremely cautious. We are dealing with forces that are rarely seen in the surface world. Take good care." He had kissed Amber, and, with absurd formality, shaken Jack's hand, making him feel that maybe he was going to his doom. Yet Silverman had been adamant. The acquisition of the skull was essential to thwart the intentions of the Shadow, intentions that, if left unchallenged, might lead to its release. He had only spoken elliptically of the consequences of that eventuality, but Jack had heard enough to realise that whatever misdemeanours the Wolf Society had been perpetrating would seem trivial by comparison. And who exactly was in this society, he wondered. His mind drifted back to his first visit to St. Just, to the odd characters clustered in the bar of the commercial hotel, to their curious glances. Our local conservation society. They had seemed harmless enough then. Perhaps they were. He felt a spasm of guilt. If what the professor said was true, and they had been possessed, for want of a better word, then it seemed that he himself had been responsible for that the day he'd visited the mines. He thought back to the chilling laughter, the dark shadows crowding round the buildings as he looked back at them, remembered his sense of disquiet at what he may have done. Yes, he was conscious even then that he was leaving the mines in a more dangerous state than he had found them. That visit! Nothing had been the same since. Yet he'd had to go, hadn't he? He was roused from his thoughts by Amber turning the car in the muddy entrance to a field, then pulling it off the road so it faced the right direction for their return. "We may need to make a quick escape," she explained in an even voice. "I don't want to park too near, though. We'll have to walk the rest of the way." She switched off the lights and engine. Now there was only the moonlight to guide them. They got out of the car, Jacob slowly uncoiling himself awkwardly from his confinement, and made their way along the remainder of the track. At its end it opened out into a rutted turning circle in front of another gate, in which were parked a battered Land Rover and several other off-roaders, all unoccupied. Wheel Owls was about a quarter of a mile ahead of them across a field, perched on a promontory like a beacon. The unlikely trio scaled the gate and struck out for it, Amber leading the way and Jacob bringing up the rear with lumbering, deliberate steps. It occurred to Jack that they had no weapons of any kind. Well, Jacob could be their weapon. Hadn't the professor said he was all but invincible? He had a feeling that Silverman intensely disliked violence of any kind, and yet he clearly did not expect the Wolf Society, in their present condition, simply to surrender the precious skull without any sort of resistance. If the Society was as dangerous as Silverman claimed, they would need guile, that much was certain. But strangely enough, no one had discussed a specific plan at all. They were, it seemed, just strolling into a lethal situation. How had he got mixed up in such a business? Jack glanced around warily. The golem loomed behind, a bulky, reassuring shadow, solidly ploughing on. Now they were close to the engine house. It reared up before them, tall in silhouette, its chimney pointing starkly to the night sky, looking for all the world like some curious ancient chapel. Beyond, the cliffs fell away, and there stretched a calm, vast sea. It was a still night. Lights illuminated the arched windows. All was quiet within. Amber led the way around to the right of the building, away from the entrance, where they could hear the faint murmur of the sea against the rocks below. She caught Jack by the arm and drew him close. "The meeting is going on in there now. It's a full session, so there could be up to 30 of them." "How do you know that?" asked Jack in a fierce whisper, suddenly feeling irritated by always being one step behind in the knowledge stakes. She held the stone of her pendant out to him, and despite the dark, he knew she was smiling. "I have an advantage, you see," she said. "The stones again." "Exactly." She sounded just like her father. "So what's your plan? Just barge in and ask for the thing?" "That's not funny. I'm not sure, though." He realized that for all her brave face, Amber was just improvising. There was no plan. "Look," he said, trying to sound positive, "it's not going to be that difficult. We've got Jacob. These people aren't athletes or anything. From what I saw, some of them are pretty ancient. Let's try and get a look at what's going on, and then I'll go in and create a distraction. They don't know me, after all. I can pretend I've got lost or something, and while they're distracted, you can take the skull. Jacob can watch out for you, just in case." Amber said nothing, but nodded in apparent agreement. Jack's reflections in the car had given him a new sense of responsibility for the whole situation. He felt the onus was on him to do something to rectify it. Without waiting for more discussion, he led the way around the exposed seaward side of the building and back to the entrance. A brief cold wind bit into his face, making his eyes water and sting with tears. Yes, he felt nervous, but there was more to it than that. Another feeling, running below that, of nerves, deeper and more visceral. They paused on the threshold. The door stood partly open. From inside, the warm aroma of engine oil wafted out into the night air. By the big cylinder of the engine, Jack could see the back of what looked like a woman, wearing a dark cloak and hood, her arms raised aloft and head bowed, as if in worship. He moved closer, and could now see, fanned out in an arc facing her, about 24 people, standing with hands clasped before them in a ritualistic attitude, concentrating on the figure before them. Amber said in a hoarse whisper, "Look, they're in the middle." At that moment, the strangely dressed woman moved to one side, and Jack saw that on the floor, in the centre of the group, was an object, a human skull, resting on what looked like a silver plate. It was this that was clearly the focus of attention. Amber craned forward to get a better view, fingering her necklace as she did so, pressing the resin pendant hard into the palm of her hand. Professor Silverman sat alone in his living room. His cravat was loosened and spilled over his shirt. He still wore his smoking jacket, and the stub of a large cigar resting in an ashtray beside him emitted tendrils of smoke. Owen Tyak's diary, the subject of much recent perusal, lay open on an occasional table. A fire burned low in the grate. The fuel had almost expired, but tonight there was no Jacob to replenish it. Only a single lamp provided illumination. On the low table before the professor were his divining stones. The large central stone he had removed and held interposed between the fingertips of both hands. His eyes were closed, but the lids flickered and twitched in restless concentration, while in his mind shapes massed and gathered, coalescing into vague forms. A scent of hot oil seemed to fill his nostrils. Through a swirl of inward impressions, his inner eye now showed the scene before his daughter, not as she saw it indeed, but as a play of feelings, evil and warped. At their centre he could connect with a formidably strong source of power, the skull of Owen Tyak. Silverman's fingers briefly flickered over the other specimens in their trays before returning to the master stone. He frowned with the effort of concentration and spoke aloud, although there was no one to hear. "They have it. I see it. You must go on, but beware, beware." Morgana Trevose led the destruction ritual, the skull at its centre. Her motions became ever more extravagant, her gyrations accompanied by the hiss of steam slowly escaping from the huge engine around her. The entire group dropped to its knees, and they all bowed their heads, remaining in this position for several minutes. Whoopings, squeaks, and dry clicking sounds echoed down from the roof space, creating a fretful racket that should have prevented concentration of any kind. The Wolf Society members, however, seemed quite unperturbed, rising to their feet and following Morgana to a row of trestle tables arranged along one whitewashed wall of the building. The skull was thus left temporarily unattended. A heaven-sent opportunity, if ever there was one. Jack was steeling himself to stride confidently in when Amber, seeing her chance, suddenly scuttled out from their cover. "Wait, Amber!" he hissed, certain their plan would be ruined by this hastiness. For a few moments she was completely exposed. In seconds she had scooped up the skull and was making for the door when Morgana turned and, seeing what was happening, gave a harsh, gurgling cry. A cry like no other, with a terrible wailing quality to it. Her hood fell back to reveal a shocking countenance, all tousled hair, sunken cheeks, and scaring cadaver-like eyes. At this point Amber, with terrible luck, slipped on a patch of grease, and before she could recover, found her escape blocked by two other society members who had moved with incredible swiftness between her and the exit. She froze, panting, eyes wide like a frightened rabbit, while Morgana, with a chilling sigh of satisfaction, advanced venomously towards her. "I think we have found our spy," she announced to the group in general, as the others also turned to face the hapless girl. Jack, still watching from the door, noticed how they all wore hungry, fanatical expressions that made them almost unrecognisable. As his mind raced to find a new plan, he was suddenly and roughly pushed aside by a great force. Jacob shouldered past him and burst into the engine house, his arms raised and slicing through the warm air like the sails of a windmill. Immediately, the two society members who had blocked Amber's exit were scythed down by the flailing giant, the others falling back in horror at this towering apparition. They had, however, the presence of mind to grab Amber and drag her and her precious cargo into their midst, closing around her, and thus making escape impossible without further conflict. Worse, Jack was dismayed to see others streaming down the upper gallery. The group was larger than he had first realized. Jack had been fighting to keep his cool, knowing that an impulsive response could ruin them all, but as these events unfolded, he suddenly felt consumed by a vast, spontaneous rage, and he too ran out into the grim theatre of the engine hall. Seeing him, Morgana gave a start of surprise. Confusion rapidly followed, to the appalling din of chirruping and squeaking noises from the vexed spirits that Morgana had summoned. Jacob set about the main body of the group, lunging, flailing, and sending it scattering. From the melee, Amber emerged, amazingly still clutching the precious skull. She was trying to pass it to Jack, but more members, aware of its worth, clustered round to prevent her. They would, however, have been in vain given Jacob's great strength, but for an unfortunate accident. The greasy floor that had already proved Amber's downfall now caused the golem to slip. He fell to his knees, and while he was down, Jack watched in horror and amazement as Morgana leapt up onto his shoulders. As he rose to his full height again, clearly disorientated, she wrapped her legs around his neck and clung hard to his head. Her fingers clutched at his forehead, feeling, probing. Jack gave a great lunge and sent several acolytes flying, clearing the way for Amber to toss the skull to Jack, who was nearer the door. But just at that moment, the giant froze. Morgana gave a shriek of triumph as, still clinging to his shoulders, she held aloft something she had prized from the golem's forehead, the animating token of life. Still as a statue, Jacob now stood once more lifeless clay. And now something extraordinary happened. The Wolf Society became convulsed in a collective frenzy. Paying no further attention to the human intruders, they gave themselves over entirely to wild fury and descended on the stricken golem, who toppled and disappeared beneath the mob as it howled and pounded its helpless victim. The skull and the other two intruders were quite forgotten in all this. Seeing the opportunity, Jack shouted to Amber, "Come on! Come on!" She wavered, torn between the prospect of escape and the fate of Jacob. She saw the frenzied group tear and wrench at the paralysed form beneath. She looked on in horror as a terracotta-coloured arm, severed at the shoulder, was tossed aside by the mob and came to rest at her feet. It lay there, the fingers stretched out in a supplicating gesture. She froze, stunned, appalled. Jack took the initiative and grabbed her, pulling her to the door, out of the heat, the chaos and the noise. Then the two of them were running at full tilt down the slope, across the field and towards the car. At the gate he paused and glanced back. The engine-house looked as tranquil as when they had arrived, still silhouetted peacefully against the night sky. The low moon was now eclipsed by the tip of its chimney, from which smoke languidly wafted, clearly visible against the pale disk, belying the horrors taking place inside.